We have been in this series on Sunday mornings over the last several weeks. We've got, I think, 3 more Sundays, including this morning, in this. And we've been looking at rediscovering the Bible. For a lot of us, maybe some of you have been familiar with the Bible since the time you were a kid. You've read it or tried to read it. And then for others of you, looking into the Bible is a more recent endeavor for you. And so we're just looking at some ways to try to wrap our mind around the Bible, because to a lot of us, you open up the Bible, it can be really confusing. We're talking about literature that was written in some cases, like 3,000 years ago from today, in a different culture, in a totally different point in history. And so just trying to open these things up can seem really foreign sometimes. And so we're trying to figure out how we can approach the Bible in a way that helps us make more sense of it, but also understands how these writers were trying to communicate. You know, in some cases, like I said, 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. What styles of communication were they using? Because if we just approach it from our little lens of 21st century America, we're going to get some things, very, very differently than they were intended. And so we're just trying to learn some tips for how to approach different things in the Bible to understand it better. We've talked about Bible stories or narratives in the last several weeks, and how to approach these different stories that are made up of specific scenes. Again, you're not getting all the information like we would get today. You're getting just what the authors want to take you on a journey, to cause you to think through some things and to learn some things from them. We talked about poetry the last couple of weeks and how a third of the Bible is actually ancient poetry. It's arranged in these 2-line couplets, most of it is, and those 2 lines are connected in some way. They either finish the statement, or they restate something, or they contrast something. And even just knowing that simple fact helps you kind of get some deeper meaning from the poetry in the Bible. We talked about the Psalms and how the Psalms is actually an ancient prayer book that Israel used from about 400 years before Jesus onward. And so just some ways to understand and use the Psalms. Last week we talked about these confusing books called the prophets, the end of the Old Testament. And then books like Revelation that are called apocalyptic literature. They use a lot of poetry, a lot of metaphor, things that seem, again, very foreign to us. And so we need to know what the authors were trying to communicate, what those symbols meant in their culture in order to understand what the writers are saying. So if you're just kind of coming in this morning, if you want to catch any of that stuff, we have a YouTube channel called Mountain View Bible Church Utah, so you can look us up and find some of the past teaching series. Also, in a couple weeks, I'm going to have a little brochure ready, handy for you to take with you that's going to have a brief summary of what we talked about. So if you want to use it as you approach your personal Bible reading and things like that, or if you have group discussions with people about the Bible, just give you some reminders of what we've talked about. So this morning, this may not sound too riveting, but I think it'll help us a lot, make sense of things a lot. But we're talking about, specifically, we're going to transition from poetry into Bible speeches. And with Bible speeches, what we're talking about, there's 3 different types. Today we're going to look at laws in the Bible, which can seem, again, really confusing or even disturbing. If you read some of these Old Testament laws, you think, what kind of a God is this that the Bible teaches about? Because again, we're looking at things from our perspective, and we're not understanding how Israel viewed laws 3,000 years ago. But what we're going to do is watch a brief introductory video. We're going to look at, again, the first type of speeches in the Bible, laws. There's also lectures. Think of that as like a sermon or an actual speech. And then there are a lot of letters in the Bible, which are also forms of speeches. Speeches in the Bible, just think of it as something that's going to kind of lead you through a logical progression of thought. Like, here's a logical argument. Debates would fall in that category. Informational speeches, persuasive speeches. There's a lot of that kind of literature in the Bible as well. And so we're going to step into that. But again, first we're going to look at laws today, how to wrap our mind and make sense of laws in the Bible. And I've got this brief introductory video, and then after that we'll talk about a few specifics this morning. Again, just helping us become better Bible readers.
If you start reading the Bible from the beginning, you'll get about halfway through the second book, Exodus, and you'll come to a bunch of ancient laws.
Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that.
Now, these laws are all written in the literary style we call prose discourse. And they're found all over the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th books of the Bible. There's over 600 laws.
And since reading ancient law code isn't something you and your friends do a lot, odds are you're going to struggle. So, let's talk about how to read the law in the Bible.
So the first thing to remember is that the Bible is not a behavior manual with a complete list of what to do and not to do to make God happy.
Right, the Bible is an epic narrative. But in the story, God does tell people what to do.
For sure. The story begins with God's plan to rule the world through humans who will trust him and live by his wisdom. And here we find the first divine command in the Bible.
Don't eat from the tree of knowing good and evil, because the day you do, you'll die.
But the humans take the authority to know and define good and evil for themselves, and it's not good. It leads to a world of violence and death, and they're exiled from the garden.
Okay, so this was the first law in the Bible?
Well, it's the first divine command, and it invites people to trust God and live by his wisdom. And so while it's not part of the laws given to Israel, it does foreshadow them because those too are invitations to trust God's wisdom.
So when do the laws of Israel come?
Okay, here's the story. Israel is enslaved in Egypt, so God saves them and then invites them into a covenant relationship, like a marriage. And the laws make up the terms of that covenant.
And so do we get a catalog of all these laws that God gave Israel?
Actually, no, we don't get all of the laws, only examples. And these have been strategically placed in between stories about how Israel keeps violating the laws.
So I'm supposed to see that Israel's no different than the humans in the garden. They don't trust God or live by his wisdom.
Right. And so it leads to another round of tragedy, violence, and death.
And it ends in exile.
And so while the laws are good and show God's wisdom, they also expose Israel's inability to be God's faithful partners.
I'm following. But when I read the laws, I find a lot of strange stuff. Like not allowing clothing to be made of two different fabrics. Like how does that show God's wisdom?
Okay, so it's important to realize that many of these laws are ancient ritual symbols that set Israel apart, that is, made them holy. So some laws made Israel distinct from neighboring nations, while other laws kept them away from things that in their culture symbolized death, disease, and moral corruption.
Okay, but what about all of the ritual killing of animals?
Sacrifices were also ritual symbols that connected people to God. Since you, a mortal, can't ascend up to God's presence in the heavenly temple, a blameless animal that was offered could go up in your place, covering for your failures so you can know you're accepted by God.
I see. But not all of the laws are ancient rituals. Some of them are just about being a good person and treating others well.
Well, yes, but these laws aren't just about being good. They're about justice, which is a big deal to God. On the first page of the Bible, we learn that every human is made in God's image and is worthy of dignity. And these laws apply that ideal in Israel's day. In fact, these laws still underlie many of the concepts of justice and equality that we take for granted today.
But some of the laws don't seem just, like laws that allow for slavery.
Well, if you look at those laws in their ancient cultural context, you'll see that God's working with Israel as he finds them, pushing them towards justice. So slavery isn't abolished, but it is undermined. For example, Israel was supposed to reenact the Exodus liberation by releasing slaves and forgiving all debts every 7 years. This was revolutionary in the ancient world.
All right. Now, what about all the laws about Sabbath rest on the seventh day and all the 7-day feasts? I mean, what's up with all of these sevens?
Yeah, so these laws about sacred time are all connected to the first creation narrative in Genesis. God brings order out of chaos in 6 days that each have a clear beginning and end. But when you get to the 7th day, it has no end. That's because it's pointing to the ideal of humans partnering with God in his rule and rest. All of these 7-day feasts are rituals that symbolize humanity's true purpose and future hope.
Okay, so all of these laws given to Israel can fit into those basic categories.
Yes, and each category expresses a core ideal of God's wisdom. And the laws show how those ideals should be applied in the culture of ancient Israel.
But as the story makes clear, Israel failed at fulfilling the law over and over. How is God going to get humans to trust his wisdom?
Well, Moses and the prophets after him trusted that one day God would transform the human heart, so people can be faithful covenant partners who trust his wisdom. And that brings us to the story of Jesus.
Yeah, Jesus said he came to fulfill the law.
Right. He was the faithful covenant partner that Israel and all humanity was made to be, but has failed to be. Jesus lived by the divine ideals underlying the laws, And he taught that the laws are all fulfilled when you love God and love your neighbor as yourself.
And Jesus promised that God's Spirit would come and transform his followers so they too could live this way.
And so, when followers of Jesus read these laws today, we need to remember they were given to Israel in their ancient cultural setting. You couldn't follow many of them even if you tried.
But what you can do is see God's wisdom in the laws.
Right, and trust that God's Spirit can guide you to follow that wisdom as you learn to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself.
Okay, I just want to give you that video to kind of get your mind thinking, in terms of these Old Testament laws. And just to highlight this, for example, I have some friends who with all their heart believe that God intends for them to live out very specifically every Old Testament command with their life that's possible. And that's what God expects of them today. Some of them obviously are impossible because they involve temple worship in Jerusalem, and there is no temple in Jerusalem currently. But as far as is in their own power, they believe these are, God's rules for them. And I want to take you in a little bit different perspective that's based on how ancient Israelites actually viewed their own laws and how the Bible presents laws, because I think it is easy, again, to feel a sense of, is this what God wants me to live by today? There's a lot of confusion surrounding some of these laws. So I just want to take us through a little journey today. Again, these are Bible speeches. It's a type of speech that's in the Bible, specifically with laws. We have laws, lectures, letters, and this is one of those that we're going to look in today. Here's the first thought on that for reading Bible laws. First of all, laws in the Bible, they were instructions or teachings. They're put within the first 5 books of the Bible that are called Torah. Our English Bibles translate that law, but it actually means teaching or instruction. And so they're mixed in with these different stories, and they're put into a section of the Bible that's called the teaching or the instruction. So they're meant to give us instruction in God's wisdom, not just to lay out every single law and only the laws that God wants us to obey. So it's giving us wisdom that we can consult for decision making, not necessarily law codes like we think of laws today. We'll talk about that as well. In fact, let me back up to that for just a moment. In order to understand the way that laws in the Bible operate, you have to transport yourself to a different time. We have laws in America today. They're statutes, statutory laws we follow. There are these codes and these lists of exactly what the laws are. And if you break those, you can be arrested sometimes or fined or prosecuted in court. And if you don't break those laws, you can't be held accountable. So we have a very defined set of don't do these things, and these things are okay. These are the rules for living in our country. But for all of history, except for maybe the last 200 years, this has not been the case. Most societies, they've been governed by something called common law, and you probably heard of that as well. Think of common law as local customs. The thing that required cities and countries to establish these defined lists of laws like we have today were when people started to live, a diverse group of people started to live in cities and urbanized places, and then our countries kind of had these defined borders. For much of history, countries would conquer other countries and empires would rise and fall, and so the boundary lines on countries weren't really well defined. Also, most of the time you had small groups of people living together that had the same culture and the same customs. So you didn't need all these laws. It was just culturally understood what was good and what was bad and what rules you were supposed to follow. And in some small pockets of the world, that's still the case today, where very specific cultures who have inhabited places for generations, they just have a list that everybody is aware of and everybody knows. There's no code, there's no list, there's no written law. People just know because it's cultural. And that's called, again, common law. And it's been the case for most of history. And it is the case in the days of the Bible as well. And so because of that, these ancient laws, they weren't viewed as necessarily the final authority. And this actually makes sense even today. If you look at laws in our country, we can change them. Our Constitution has something called amendments. And those amendments are changes that have been added to our Constitution in light of maybe further experience and events over history that necessitated some changes. And so even in our culture, we recognize that our laws are not the final authority. There's this bigger ideal of the way that we should treat people and the way that we should live amongst other people. And those ideals are driving the law, even to the point that we're willing to amend the law or make changes if we see a need to over time. Or in America, if our court system sees a need to. We will change those things because there's something greater that we even in America see as the final authority. And in Jesus' day, you saw a group of people called the Pharisees, and they were very much living at a different perspective. They were trying to take these ancient laws and make them the rules to live by. And so you'll see them come into conflict with Jesus at different points in time. And there's this one story, Matthew 12, that I put up here. It says, at that time, Jesus walked through the grain fields on the Sabbath, the seventh day, the day of rest in Jewish society. His disciples were hungry and began to pick and eat some heads of grain, because that's what you do when you're hungry. And it was okay in their culture to do this. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, see, your disciples are doing what's not lawful to do on the Sabbath. You can't work. You can't pick grain on the Sabbath. And he said to them, haven't you read what David did when he and those who were with him, members of his army, were hungry? How they entered into the house of God, a.k.a. the temple, the tabernacle in the Old Testament that only the priests were supposed to go into. They entered into it and they ate the bread of the presence, which were these 12 loaves of bread that were in almost, not the holiest place in the temple, but the second holiest area of the temple where only the priests were allowed to enter. They went in and they ate this bread, which was only to be eaten of by priests because they were hungry. And Jesus says that wasn't lawful for David to eat or for the people with him, only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath day, the priests in the temple violate the Sabbath and they're innocent because the sacrifices and the temple worship doesn't stop, right? They still work on the Sabbath in the temple, even though it's the day of rest. The priests don't have a day of rest. And so Jesus is even introducing this concept to the Pharisees that these laws, they're not meant to be a final authority. They're meant to be wisdom from God to be considered and to be thought through. But there are situations where maybe compassion or physical human need is going to supersede a specific rule that's been written. A couple other things that you see with ancient laws concerning this aspect. Ancient laws in other cultures, think before the time of Jesus, throughout ancient culture, including in Jewish culture, these laws were almost never referred to in legal decisions. If you read maybe a decision that the Supreme Court hands down today in our country, they're going to support it, right, with different laws or different statutes or different precedents as to why they ruled the way that they ruled. Not so in ancient Israel or in any ancient culture. They wouldn't quote these laws. Now, different cultures had ancient laws. The one that you see up on the screen, actually, this is called the Code of Hammurabi. It was written about 1700 BC in Babylon by a king named Hammurabi. And this was uncovered by archaeologists in the early 1900s. And so it has all the laws for Babylon in the 1700s BC written on it, as handed down by the king. But we also have a lot of different cuneiform tablets, clay tablets from that period of time, that actually explain real-time legal decisions that judges or maybe town authorities were ruling on. What's interesting is they never quote these laws as they're rendering a decision. They consult them, but they don't ever refer to them. And oftentimes their rulings contradict some of these law codes that their king handed down, and that's commonly the case. And you can even see in the Bible, in Scripture, there are times when different things that are commanded are contradicted, such as when David and his army goes in to eat this bread inside the tabernacle or the temple because they're simply hungry, and that's the only food that's available at that point in time. They're acting in clear contradiction to a law. And so it's just a different way of viewing laws than what we think of. We think of this as these are God's rules set in stone. God forbid that anyone should ever break them. And that's not the way that ancient Israelites saw these laws. They saw them, again, as part of wisdom, part of God's teaching, as different examples. The judges, they weren't required to know the law well in ancient Israel. They were required to be morally upright people of integrity. And it was assumed that if you have integrity, then you're going to use the common law, the local customs. You're going to use these different examples of laws or guidance from God. And you're going to use practical wisdom. And you're going to roll them all up into a ball inside your head when you're confronted with this specific situation. And you're going to consult all those things and make your decision based on that. And that's what you see actually playing out throughout the Bible. Another thing about Bible laws, let's see. Let me go up to this. Bible laws were illustrations of deeper principles of wisdom, not necessarily rules to be followed in all cases and all places. And that's kind of just another way of phrasing what I've been trying to explain in the last couple of minutes. Here's another example, a couple examples from 2 Samuel. when people in the Bible violate laws in the Bible. Chapter 12 of 2 Samuel, there's a situation where David, King David, who many of us look up to, who wrote many of the Psalms that you have in the book of Psalms today, he did a couple things which were definitely against Israel's law. He had a man named Uriah murdered, and he married his wife, committed adultery with her, and then eventually married his wife. And so adultery and murder were definitely opposed, right? Those are two of the 10 Commandments. And the penalty for that in Israel's law was death. What happened to Israel? Or what happened to David as a result of breaking those laws? Nathan the prophet came and replied to him and said, God's taken away your sin, you won't die. Well, that's opposed to the law and the consequences. Exactly. Because again, they were examples and possibilities, but not end-all decisions. There was also a situation in 2 Samuel 13 where one of David's sons tragically killed another one of David's sons, kind of to enact revenge. And as a result, he came before David, and instead of David killing him, David kissed him and restored him back to becoming his son. And then the man betrayed David eventually anyway. And so there was complete forgiveness and not consequence, where consequence could have easily been given. And so you see all these things that would seem to be contradictions if you're looking at the laws of absolute requirements for all times and all places. But you see people operate outside of them all the time because there are these deeper principles of wisdom that they're meant to communicate as a result, these underlying principles. You can see examples of this in places like Psalm 24. In this psalm, David is actually trying to distill or compact all these laws. There are 613 or 611 laws in the Old Testament, if you count them and you categorize them. If you're looking at thou shalt not or thou shalt type commands, you're going to find 611. What's really interesting about that number is that that is the numerical value of the Hebrew word Torah, or instruction, or teaching, or your Bibles would translate it law. And so it's very, very probable that these 611 or so laws were chosen and placed in the Old Testament because, again, in Hebrew, the letters have a numerical value. And so if you spell out a word like Torah or law, T-O-R-A-H, the T has a certain numerical value. There's not a number in Hebrew. The letters are also numbers. And so if you add up the numerical value of each of those letters in their culture, it adds up to 611. And so these are examples of Torah or teaching or instruction, not all the list of rules. But there's a few underlying principles. And David, if he tried to condense the law into a few short phrases, this is how he would summarize it. Who may ascend to the mountain of the Lord? Who can go close to God, basically? Who can stand in his holy place? The one who has clean hands, the one who has a pure heart, the one who hasn't appealed to what's false, the one who hasn't sworn deceitfully. He will receive blessing from the Lord, righteousness from the God of his salvation. And so he's going to boil it down to those concepts of kind of being truthful and having a pure heart and having clean hands. If you go into Micah, Micah boils the law down to three things. He says, humanity, he's told each of you what is good and what the Lord requires of you. He doesn't list 611 or 613 commands. He just boils it down to three things: act justly, love faithfulness, and walk in humility before God, or with God. That's how he summarizes it. In Habakkuk, Habakkuk summarizes it with one phrase: the one in right relationship will live by his faith. So if you live by faith, that's what it means to fulfill all these laws. And Jesus, he boiled the law down to two things. What did Jesus say the law was to do? You can respond. You remember the two things? Somebody asked him, what's the greatest commandment? What?
To love God and to love your neighbor.
Yeah, love God and love your neighbors yourself. He says if you do that, you're going to fulfill the intention behind all of those laws. That's going to make sense. That's going to boil things down. Those are pathways to justice and how to treat people in a right way. So these laws, they were intended to help Israel live in right relationships with God and with each other at the heart of them. They were also invitations to consider what God's wisdom was like. And if Israel lived by these different laws or principles underneath those 600 and some laws, they were going to be distinguishable from the surrounding cultures. They were going to look different. They were going to live in a way that placed a higher value on humans and a higher value on human life and dignity, and it was going to cause them to stand out people were going to see, oh, God has higher ideals and principles that this culture is living by. Unfortunately, Israel didn't do such a great job at living that out. The Bible laws also are things that they met Israel within their ancient culture. So you'll read certain things and they seem just strange, just odd. Because again, God is giving them things that they need to know to distinguish them in an ancient cultural situation. And these things may not be relevant or applicable today. Also, because of that, you're going to see God propose laws, and you'll look at them and say, that's so archaic. Like, we've seen where a society is grown toward. For example, things that hint at this idea of slavery. You read laws and you'll think, God must approve of slavery. And what God is actually doing is he's meeting these people in their culture, trying to lead them one step closer to valuing human life and dignity. But he's not requiring them to make a light speed leap, maybe to where we are in history in some of these areas. We still deal with slavery. That's a reality today, right? On different levels, human trafficking. But many cultures have come to the point of, at least as a society, agreeing that this is a moral wrong. But back in ancient times, this was something where abuse of people in slavery was common, was rampant. And so God was leading Israel to the next step closer that would impose a little bit more value on human life, a little bit more dignity than where they were, but it wasn't necessarily the place where he eventually wanted to lead humanity toward. He was getting them closer and closer. For example, Deuteronomy 21. And if you read this again, it's disturbing to read things like this if you don't read it with that framework in mind. If you think this is what God wants for humanity, this is what God wants Israel to step closer toward, but it's not really his ideal and what he wants them to land on permanently. Maybe we're closer today in some ways than Israel was at this point in time. Deuteronomy 21, this is one of the laws. When you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God hands them over to you, and you take some of them prisoner. So you've conquered your enemies, you take them prisoner. What most soldiers would do is they would take the women in the culture and they would assault them and abuse them and leave them. And so God is saying, Israel, you will not operate this way. Here's one step closer to justice, but it's not justice. It's getting them closer. Just like God works with you and I, brings us closer and closer to what he wants us to be, even though we'll never quite attain that in our life. So he says to Israel, if you see a beautiful woman among the captives, which soldiers did and assaulted, you desire her and you want to take her as your wife. So here's the first thing. You want this person to become your wife. You're not just going to abuse her and leave her or kill her like most armies would. You're to bring her into your house. She is to shave her head, trim her nails, remove the clothes that she was wearing when she was taken prisoner, live in your house, and mourn for her father and mother a full month, which would have been unheard of. Nobody would have allowed someone on a battlefield scene, in a village they had just plundered or a town they had just burned with women and kids who were alive. No one would have taken those people into their home, let alone given them a month to grieve. Now, is this the fullness of justice? Wouldn't it be better just to let those people live and not take them into your home? Sure, of course. That would be what we would consider to be just. But again, God is wanting them to become more just, and he's taking them where they are and moving them closer to his ideal, even though he doesn't slingshot them to the complete, ideal where he's at. But he says, when you do it, this is how you're supposed to relate, to value human life more than the societies around you. After that, you may have intimate relations with her and be her husband, and she'll be your wife. Then if you're not satisfied with her, you'll let her go where she wants. You must not sell her or treat her as merchandise because you've humiliated her. So there's that concession in there too, that by doing this, you're actually humiliating someone. And so even in that statement, you can see the ideal. This is not really what God desires, but it's a concession that's given to prevent slavery, to prevent more injustice, to prevent the injustice that the other nations were fine with around them. And so you see these kinds of things in Old Testament laws. God is moving Israel closer, but you and I would look at this today and say that's not the ideal, because somebody's still getting humiliated here. Wouldn't it be better to be completely just? And the answer is, of course, yes, it would. And that's what God ultimately wants to lead people toward, not necessarily what's expressed to Israel at that moment in history. And so you have to understand these things as you read the laws. Last thing this morning, if you had 4 buckets, you could put each of those 611 or 613 laws into one of those 4 buckets. There's 4 different categories. He mentioned that on the video. I want to name the categories slightly differently because I think it'll give us a little bit better, make it a little clearer, hopefully, as far as how we would categorize different things. So here's the first category, calendar laws. A lot of laws talk to Israel about how to use their time. They talk about this day, the Sabbath day, the 7th day of the week, and how that's a day set aside for rest and set aside for worship. It's not set aside for work, and everyone from the lowest person in society to the greatest gets a day off 1 day a week. Unheard of in the ancient world. But there are some deeper principles behind that teach us rhythms that are helpful for our life. And so as we look back on these laws and we contemplate them, we're not thinking, God, in order to please God, I have to keep this rule. So every 7th day of the week, every Saturday, I could do no work. I can't light a fire to cook with, so that means no barbecuing. I can't do this, I can't do that. There's a deeper principle, and that is that humanity needs a break. Humanity needs rest. 6 days are enough to order the chaos in your life. You need a break. And so there are these underlying principles that we can learn from today. There are laws about feast days and festivals because there are times to reflect and there are times to celebrate. And even though the times and places for celebration and the ways of celebration might be different 3,000 years later today for us, at heart, we all need times of celebration and times of reflection. We all need holidays on the calendar. There were also years when in Israel, every 7 years, all debts would be forgiven. So think about that. You borrow money from someone in the United States of America. Every 7 years, those debts go back to 0, and nobody's in debt anymore. Every 50 years, if anyone was enslaved in Israel, all the slaves were to be set free. Every 7 years, the land was supposed to get a rest. No crops would be grown. So you'd have to prepare for 6 years for 1 year without growing any food across your entire nation. And these things had deeper principles that, again, Israel was supposed to learn from. But we can learn things from how we order our time, from how they ordered time as well. These same principles, these same ideals, maybe there's something that's important for us to consider today as well, because maybe we misuse our time. So there are things for us to learn, but there were specific applications for Israel to get them in this rhythm of time. Second bucket, purity laws. And these are perhaps the strangest. There are a lot of things in their culture, and if you find a strange law, chances are, if you don't know the bucket for it, this is the bucket. Because there are cultural things like if a house gets mildew and mold, you're supposed to break down walls or break down the house, or there are things about bodily issues that you read about that just seem weird or creepy or just strange. And these are things that in their culture, they are synonymous with disease and death. For example, if your body is leaking substance or if you have some skin disease, the idea is healthy bodies don't leak. And so they're trying to separate and differentiate between disease and death and health. And so oftentimes people who are in conditions that remind their society in their day of somebody with a disease or somebody with death, those people are not allowed to come into the temple to worship. Because in their culture, the temple, it's depictive of the Garden of Eden. It's depictive of God's presence and walking into God's presence. And God is a source of life, not a source of death, not a source of disease. So there's a cultural separation, but it's for emphasis. It's so that you realize God's presence is a place filled with life, not a place filled with death and disease. And so things in their culture that symbolize death and disease are kept away from places that they associate with God's presence. So there's a big bucket dump of these things, again, culturally, that remind them of death and disease. With our antibacterial soap, chances are most of these things will not be issues for you or for us today. But in that day and time, they're associated with that, so they're kept separate. Third bucket, sacrificial laws. These are different ways that Israel is taught to approach God. Because people, in their state of rebellion against God, there's a separation between them and God. And so they need something, specifically something innocent, to bridge the gap between them and God, which is where with Jesus, God's Son who was given, who was sacrificed in the same way that these animals were in the Old Testament, who were innocent, who were without blemish. Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice to end all sacrifices, maybe from our perspective as the church, as followers of Jesus. But in the Old Testament, these sacrifices are taking an innocent life and using that as a bridge to allow somebody who is rebellious and corrupt, who has opposed God and his ideals in many ways, to come near to God or to have fellowship with others. Some of the sacrifices were consumed as meals together to foster a sense of community, or given to the priest to subsidize their living, or consumed with poor people in a community to bring a community of people together. So it was nearness to God and also things that would bring nearness to people. So there's bucket number 3. Final bucket are civil laws. And these are just a whole variety of laws that were given to Israel in their society to value human life and to enable them to love their neighbors in their culture. And if you try to apply straight across the board all these laws, it might just get odd or strange. You don't have to worry about oxen running around your community, goring people at random like they did. And so many of these civil laws will seem strange. But if you're walking around ancient Israel, these things are very, very practical. And so if we want to use these laws today, we have to look for underlying principles, bigger ideas that these laws are teaching about how we relate in community with each other, how we come near to God, how we avoid maybe disease and death and separate ourselves from those things in our culture, and how we use our time. There are principles that are beneficial to us, but if we see the laws as a list of rules that God requires from everyone in all places and all times, it'll get really frustrating and really confusing. And so that's maybe how they viewed laws in their culture, as ways, as examples, as illustrations of God's wisdom played out, but as things that were fluid, as things that you could learn from, as things that you could change, and potentially even ignore or avoid in certain circumstances if there was a more important underlying ideal beneath it that could better be accomplished another way. And so again, a way to rethink all these laws. About 10% of the Bible are these laws as you come across them. We're going to go ahead and pray this morning. Again, this is kind of, it's not like we came to a passage and we looked at a chapter in the Bible and said, here's all we can learn from it. But hopefully things that will help you as you encounter some of these things that just seemed odd maybe before this point in time in the Bible, in the way that they were intended to be interacted with.